and Clark expedition painstakingly documented the uncharted West and befriended the many Native American tribes they met along the way. That's the story you were told in school, but the real expedition was far more brutal. This is the messed up truth about the Lewis and Clark expedition. As Lewis and Clark prepared for their expedition into the Western Territories, the United States government gave them numerous goals to accomplish. Foremost, they were to find a northwest passage that connected the rivers of the Atlantic to the rivers of the Pacific, allowing for continuous water travel across North America. A mission they would fail, as the Northwest Passage turned out to be a myth. Furthermore, they were to keep detailed records of the plants and animals of the West and to map out as much of the territory as possible. But an often ignored goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to gain the loyalty of the Native American tribes of the West. As the Corps of Discovery encountered new tribes on its push to the Pacific, they informed the native people that they were living on land that was now part of the United States. Lewis and Clark would offer gifts to the tribes, from knives to piece metals, and encourage them to obey the rules of the United States government. But the Corps of Discovery also demonstrated the steep price of disobeying the United States. In front of each tribe, they would fire off their guns in a display of military power. Lewis and Clark knew that their dangerous voyage required obedient men. So in the early stages of the expedition, the two captains decided to construct an impromptu legal system whereby they would court-martial and punish any members of the Corps who disobeyed orders. Numerous enlisted men were penalized under this disciplinary system, especially in the first year of the expedition. John Collins was accused of getting drunk at his post. He pleaded not guilty, but a jury of his peers disagreed. Collins was sentenced to receive 100 lashes on his back. Another man, Alexander Willard, was also sentenced to 100 lashes for falling asleep while on guard duty. The diet of the Corps was diverse and unusual. The Corps departed with nearly 7 tons of dry goods, including flour, salt, coffee, pork, corn, sugar, beans, and lard. The men particularly loved meat and would hunt for elk and buffalo whenever they could. Luckily for them, animals were abundant across much of the Great Plains. When the men found themselves running low on food, they often obtained more by trading with native tribes in exchange for tools and weapons. And along the way, Sacagawea helped the Corps identify which plants were edible and which were not. Journals from the expedition reveal that the protein-starved men ate horse meat on numerous occasions, although it probably came from wild horses. In their trek across the western United States, the men of the Corps of Discovery fell prey to a variety of illnesses and injuries. One man became severely ill in the first few months of the trip and died shortly after. This was Sergeant Charles Floyd, who, according to modern historians, likely succumbed to a burst appendix. After Floyd's death so early in the mission, Lewis and Clark probably expected to lose many more of their men. To treat their men, Lewis and Clark primarily relied on a powerful mercury-based laxative. These pills were colloquially known as Rush's Thunderbolts after Benjamin Rush, who manufactured them. The mercury often made the men sicker than they were before. Interestingly, modern historians have been able to track the exact voyage of the Lewis and Clark expedition by looking for mercury deposits left behind by the men's stool. For the most part, Lewis and Clark's men were able to stay on the good side of the native tribes they encountered. That's not to say that the Corps' men and the native peoples were immediately best friends. There were many tense interactions between the two groups. One noteworthy example occurred early in the expedition, in the territory of the Lakota along the Missouri River. When Lewis and Clark met the Lakota, they immediately began preaching obedience to the United States and displaying their military power. Then after eating together, the Corps initiated trading with the Lakota, who were led by Chief Black Buffalo. But a sect of the Lakota, who were rivals with Black Buffalo, decided to create tension with the Corps, seizing the cable of a docked boat and demanding more goods. Clark escalated hostilities much further, drawing his sword and ordering his men to point their guns at Lakota. Thankfully, Black Buffalo intervened, reprimanding the Americans but ordering the Lakota to fall back. The Corps of Discovery stayed with the tribe for several more days, and the relationship remained mixed. Clark would later refer to the Lakota as, quote, the vilest miscreants of the savage race. Violent conflict with Native Americans wasn't the only threat that the Corps faced. Unbeknownst to the Corps' men, The government of Spain felt that the expedition was an encroachment upon their territory and feared that it could be a precursor to further American expansion to the west. Although the United States government had purchased a massive amount of land from France, Spain still owned all the land west of the Louisiana Territory, as far north as modern-day Oregon. When word about the expedition spread, the Spanish governor of New Mexico sent a force of 52 soldiers to intercept the expedition. When the force reached the territory of the Pawnee, they learned that the Corps of Discovery had passed through the area, but were long gone by that time. A second force of 100 men also failed to hunt down the Corps, as they were forced to return to New Mexico after a Pawnee attack. Spain, refusing to give up, sent a third force of 300 men, but this group quickly fizzled as the soldiers turned against their commander. A final force of 600 men was mustered to capture Lewis and Clark and to persuade native tribes in the region to side with Spain. Once again, this force failed. Without realizing it, Lewis and Clark had evaded the largest military force Spain ever sent into the Great Plains. Despite certain tense interactions, the Corps of Discovery was able to maintain friendly relations with most of the native tribes they encountered. The native peoples would show their hospitality in a variety of ways. Dances and peace ceremonies were common, the practice of wife sharing. At the time, it was common for native men to allow white visitors to sleep with their wives as a sign of goodwill. Unfortunately, this likely occurred without regard for whether their wives consented or not. As we now know, wife sharing led to the rapid spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Many native women in the West had already contracted STDs from sleeping with French and British traders. These diseases were then passed on to the men of the expedition. Lewis and Clark had prepared for their men to contract venereal diseases, but at the time, treatment options were limited. Crazy VD, and Lewis, he would have to give them a mercury tonic. Mercury on your genitals! Come on! Crazy, it's crazy poisonous. The Corps was able to avoid outright conflict with most of the native tribes they met, but that changed in 1806 when an encounter with the Blackfeet tribe ended in tragedy. On the return trip from the Pacific, Lewis and Clark decided that the men should break into smaller groups in order to survey more of the unexplored Western territories. Lewis took his crew up north, landing them in the territory of the Blackfeet, a native tribe known for their military dominance in the region. Lewis' crew encountered 8 Blackfeet men who decided to camp with them for the night. But things went awry when Lewis informed the Blackfeet that some of their rival tribes, the Shoshone and Nez Perce, had already agreed to ally with the United States and would be receiving supplies and weaponry in return. The Blackfeet felt threatened by the news that the power balance in the area was rapidly shifting. During the night, the Blackfeet reportedly attempted to steal the Corps' guns. In the fight that ensued, Lewis reports that one of his men stabbed a Blackfeet warrior, while he personally shot another who was attempting to run off with the crew's horses. After the fight, 2 men were dead at the hands of the Corps of Discovery. As a result, the Blackfeet closed off their territory to Americans for the next 80 years. It's been said that Thomas Jefferson thought it would take 100 generations for Americans to thoroughly settle the lands west of the Mississippi. The American people did it in under 5. After the conclusion of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1806, the westward expansion of the United States began in earnest. Throughout the 19th century, more territory was added to the U.S., while native people were forcibly pushed further and further west. It's estimated that the Native American population declined from 600,000 in 1800 to a mere 237,000 in 1900. The land held by native tribes suffered an even sharper decline. The deception, that's what hurt our people later on. Why couldn't they be truthful, you know? It's unclear whether Lewis and Clark openly supported this brutal territorial expansion. The men had promised most of the tribes they encountered that they would be treated with respect by the U.S. government. But did they honestly believe that was the case? It's hard to say for sure. But we do know that Lewis and Clark's expedition west inspired many future settlers to do the same, and that the geographic and scientific information they collected was of great benefit to America's future expansion. After completing their mission, nearly every member of the Corps of Discovery was given a generous reward. Besides monthly wages, each enlisted man received 320 acres of land, while Lewis and Clark both received 1,600 acres. While Sacagawea received nothing, Her husband Charbonneau was granted the same payment as the other enlistees, but one man was left out entirely. That man was York, the expedition's sole African-American participant and personal slave to William Clark. Slaves who went above and beyond for their masters were sometimes freed, but when the mission concluded, William Clark refused to free York. Furthermore, Clark denied York's appeal to be hired out to the farm in Louisville, where his wife worked. Clark did ultimately free York sometime before the 1830s, but he continued to claim that York preferred life as a slave. There is some mystery surrounding the death of Sacagawea. 3 years after the expedition had finished, Sacagawea's family accepted an invitation from William Clark to come live in St. Louis. Clark gave her and her husband Charbonneau some land to farm and offered their son Jean-Baptiste a Western education. But farming proved unsuccessful, so Sacagawea and Charbonneau joined a fur trading expedition, leaving Jean-Baptiste under the guardianship of William Clark. After this point, written records of Sacagawea's life become sparse. It's reported that she gave birth to a daughter, Lisette, in late 1812 and became fatally ill soon after. According to the Journal of Fur Trader John Ludig, she died of a fever on the evening of December 20th, 1812. Historians have generally accepted this as Sacagawea's official death date. She was only 25 years old. William Clark adopted both Lisette and Jean-Baptiste the following year, but Lisette likely died as an infant. Native American oral tradition says that Sacagawea left her husband and moved out west, eventually returning to the Shoshone tribe in Wyoming, where she remained until her death in 1884. If this is true, then Sacagawea would have been in her 90s when she died. A happy ending for the most beloved member of the Corps of Discovery expedition. Not only was he celebrated as an American hero and granted 1,600 acres of land, but President Thomas Jefferson personally appointed Lewis to be the governor of the new Upper Louisiana Territory. But honor did not bring Captain Lewis happiness. He'd been plagued by depression for much of his life, a mental illness that may have been exacerbated by neurosyphilis, according to some modern medical historians. His depression left him incapable of completing a journal of his expedition, which disappointed President Jefferson. To add insult to injury, Lewis's dealings with the War Department left him in steep debt, so he took a trip to Washington, D.C. to sort out his financial situation. In 1809, in a remote inn on the route to Washington, Meriwether Lewis took his own life. He was 35 years old, but the circumstances surrounding Lewis' death have led some to speculate that he was actually killed. Lewis was found with gunshot wounds to both the head and chest, and the innkeeper's wife reportedly saw him crawling around before he died. It was also well known that bandits roamed the area. Could Lewis have been the victim of a mugging gone awry? Possibly, but it's far more likely that his death was a tragic botched suicide. Lewis had composed his will before his trip to D.C. and had attempted suicide just a few weeks earlier.